led Burkina Faso has refused to accept deportees from the United States in a snub to one of President Donald Trump's signature migration policies.
The U.S. tried to turn Burkina Faso into a dumping ground for deportees, but Ouagadougou slammed the door. In one bold move, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government told Washington, "Africa is not your landfill, it's your equal." What followed wasn't diplomacy. It was blackmail, dressed as a visa policy. So, what is really happening? Let's find out. It began quietly, the kind of diplomatic request that usually slips beneath headlines, a note, a meeting, a proposal. But in that soft language of diplomacy, a storm was hiding. Washington had asked Burkina Faso to take in deportees from the United States, including people from other nations who had no connection to Burkinabe soil. For most governments, such a demand would have been met with quiet compliance or bureaucratic delay. But in Ouagadougou, something snapped. Foreign Minister Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré didn't wait for committee discussions or consultations with Western advisors. He walked into the state broadcaster's studio and did what few African officials ever dare. He called it what it was: blackmail. He told the nation that the U.S. Embassy had made repeated requests for Burkina Faso to host migrants expelled from American soil. He revealed that after rejecting this so-called partnership, the U.S. suddenly suspended all visa services in the country. The timing, he said, was no coincidence. "Is this a way to put pressure on us? Is this blackmail?" he asked, his tone neither rhetorical nor pleading. It was the sound of defiance. That word, blackmail, hit harder than any policy statement. It wasn't just aimed at Washington. It was aimed at a long history of coercion dressed as cooperation. Within hours of his statement, the U.S. Embassy's website confirmed it. No more visas issued in Ouagadougou. Students, traders, and families would now have to travel to neighboring Togo to apply. It was a technical move, on paper, but in political language, it was punishment. The message was clear: if you don't bend, you'll feel it. But Traoré's words turned what was meant to be a quiet diplomatic maneuver into a continental headline. "Burkina Faso," he said, "is a place of dignity, a destination, not a place of expulsion." That single sentence flipped the power dynamic. It transformed a small administrative dispute into a declaration of African agency. It drew a moral boundary line where once there had only been obedience. The context makes this moment even sharper. The U.S., under Donald Trump's return-era immigration crackdown, has been looking for new third countries to absorb migrants it refuses to host, especially Africans, Central Americans, and Caribbeans. But for Burkina Faso, this wasn't just about migration. It was about meaning. Why should an African nation become the repository for others' rejects? Why should a country that's rebuilding from years of insurgency and foreign interference suddenly carry the political burden of American deportation policies? Burkina Faso saw the hidden insult, a message that African borders could still be managed by Western convenience. That's why this incident struck such a deep nerve. This wasn't just about who gets a visa or who doesn't. It was about the invisible line between cooperation and submission, a line that Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government has refused to cross since taking power. And yet, the question that now looms is larger. Why is the United States so desperate to push deportees into African nations? The answer lies in a quiet industry that most of the world doesn't even realize exists: the global outsourcing of deportation. It's a system built on power imbalance, where Western countries use diplomatic influence, aid, and legal loopholes to move their immigration burdens onto nations too small or too dependent to say no. And until now, it worked almost flawlessly. To understand the depth of it, we have to start with how deportation became a bargaining chip. For the United States, migration isn't just a domestic debate, it's a geopolitical instrument. Whenever its detention centers overflow or immigration policies come under fire, Washington looks outward for partners. These are usually countries with fragile economies, mounting debts, or strategic importance in global politics. A few $1 million in aid here, a military training program there, and suddenly, a nation agrees to temporarily host individuals deported from U.S. soil, even when they aren't its citizens. It's a clean arrangement for the West. The headlines stay at home. Deportation completed. The humanitarian image remains intact, cooperation achieved, and the moral cost? Outsourced. But for the countries on the receiving end, the story is darker. They are displaced people with no identity papers, no economic future, and no ties to local society. What begins as partnership often turns into silent chaos, overburdened shelters, security problems, and social unrest. That's why Burkina Faso's rejection wasn't a simple policy choice. It was a rejection of an entire system of displacement diplomacy. It saw what others had ignored. Countries like Rwanda, Ghana, Eswatini, and South Sudan had already accepted small batches of deportees in exchange for promises of development support. On paper, it seemed harmless, a humanitarian gesture. But in reality, it blurred sovereignty itself. When a nation accepts foreigners expelled by another power, it signals one thing, that its borders are open not by its will, but by negotiation. And here lies the hypocrisy that Traoré's government couldn't ignore. The same nations that claim to uphold human rights are the ones using financial muscle to offload human beings like cargo. They speak of cooperation, yet the terms are never equal. One side pays, the other side absorbs. It's not diplomacy, it's containment disguised as partnership. Burkina Faso refused to play that role because it understood the precedent. If you accept one deportee, you've accepted the principle that your territory can be used for someone else's political convenience. And for a government that has been rebuilding its national identity after years of foreign interference, that was a step backward. But Washington's reaction, freezing visas and signaling consequences, exposed something even more revealing. It proved that deportation deals are not humanitarian efforts. They are geopolitical weapons. So the question now shifts. If America uses visas to punish resistance, what does that tell us about the kind of power it really wields over African nations? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. If deportation was the bait, visas became the whip. Washington's swift suspension of visa services in Burkina Faso revealed how the world's most powerful nations use bureaucracy as a weapon of obedience. No troops, no sanctions, no threats, just a few lines on an embassy website, and suddenly, thousands of Burkinabe citizens are locked out of opportunity. It's soft power at its coldest form. Control not through force, but through permission. The logic is brutally simple. In today's interconnected world, mobility is a privilege. The ability to travel, study, or trade abroad is often the only way for individuals from developing countries to climb economically. Western nations understand this, which is why they turn visas into levers. Comply, and your people move freely. Resist, and your airports turn into walls. The brilliance of it, from a strategic standpoint, is that it doesn't target governments directly. It punishes the middle class, the educated, and the ambitious, the very demographic that normally pushes for stability and Western alignment. When these citizens start feeling the pain, they pressure their own government to fix relations. But in Burkina Faso, this tactic met an unexpected wall. The country has spent the last few years detoxing from dependency, systematically cutting the strings of external control. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the government no longer measures success by how many smiles it earns in Western capitals, but by how much control it retains over its own soil. When the visa freeze hit, Traoré didn't issue an apology or a statement of regret. He let silence speak. It was a calculated refusal to validate Washington's move. Because if you treat coercion as dialogue, you've already surrendered the narrative. The deeper issue, though, isn't just the visa suspension, it's what it symbolizes. Visas have become the 21st century colonial passbook, the modern equivalent of the old permits that determined which Africans could move and which could not under foreign rule. Back then, colonial administrators used paper passes to decide who could cross a border. Today, it's embassy algorithms doing the same, deciding who gets a chance at opportunity and who remains grounded. Different tools, same philosophy, mobility is control, and the irony is staggering. The same West that lectures Africa about open borders, global cooperation, and shared humanity uses travel documents as instruments of punishment. It's not about national security, it's about compliance. It's about reminding smaller nations who decide the terms of engagement in a supposedly free world. For Burkina Faso, this became the ultimate test of self-definition. Would it buckle under pressure for the sake of convenience, or stand firm for the sake of principle? It chose the latter, and in doing so, exposed how fragile Western dominance has become. Because once a nation stops fearing isolation, isolation loses its power. But what happens when others notice? When other African nations realize that a single refusal didn't destroy Burkina Faso, it strengthened it. That's the moment when defiance transforms into unity. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Burkina Faso's defiance didn't stop at its borders. It sent ripples across a continent that has long lived in the tension between cooperation and coercion. For decades, African nations have navigated relationships with Western powers like tightrope walkers, balancing the need for aid with the desire for autonomy. But the moment Ouagadougou stood its ground, something began to shift. It was as if a pressure valve had finally been released. Other African nations began asking themselves the same question that Burkina Faso had already answered. At what point does cooperation become subjugation? The timing couldn't have been more significant. Africa is changing, politically, psychologically, and generationally. The old guard that once ruled through Western validation is fading, replaced by a younger, more assertive leadership. These leaders didn't grow up during colonialism. They grew up studying how it survived under new names, partnerships, aid, and cooperation agreements. They watched as promises of democracy and development often ended in debt traps, proxy wars, and resource extraction. And so, they've begun rewriting the rules of engagement, refusing to play the game of polite dependency. Burkina Faso's stance has become both a mirror and a catalyst. Nigeria's refusal to take deportees from the US is no longer seen as stubbornness, but as solidarity. Eritrea's rejection of Western migration deals, once painted as isolationist, now reads like foresight. Even countries like Ghana and Rwanda, which previously cooperated with Western deportation programs, are now facing domestic backlash from citizens who see these agreements for what they are: modern instruments of control disguised as policy. This growing mood of resistance isn't anti-Western, it's pro-African. It's not about burning bridges, it's about choosing which bridges to cross. Across the continent, from the Sahel to the Horn, a subtle consensus is forming that dignity is no longer negotiable. It's not just Burkina Faso's message, it's Africa's awakening. In academic circles, analysts call this the rise of assertive sovereignty, a shift where African nations are beginning to define partnership on their own terms. It's visible in trade, in security, in technology, and now, in migration policy. No longer are African states accepting deals that treat them as instruments to fix Western domestic problems. They are demanding equality, not charity, collaboration, not compliance. The resonance of Burkina Faso's decision lies in its timing. In an era where African countries are uniting around regional blocs, exploring intra-African trade, and forming new partnerships with non-Western powers like China and Russia, standing firm against Western pressure carries symbolic power. It tells the world that Africa no longer fears being alone, and that's where the true anxiety lies in Western capitals, not in Burkina Faso's defiance itself, but in the possibility of imitation. Because if one country can reject a US demand and survive, what happens when 5 do? Or 10? The answer is the birth of a new political psychology, one where African nations see refusal not as rebellion, but as responsibility. The age of submission is closing, and the age of assertion has begun. But what truly makes this transformation unstoppable isn't politics, it's purpose. Because now the question is, no longer can Africa resist, but why must it? Every movement begins with a moment of refusal, one act of defiance that forces the world to pause, to reevaluate the balance of power. That's what Burkina Faso's stand represents, not an isolated political disagreement, but a turning point in Africa's moral and strategic evolution. When a small landlocked country dared to confront the United States and called its bluff, It redefined what power means on African soil. And that's where this story transforms from confrontation into awakening. For decades, Africa's image was shaped by narratives of need, a continent waiting to be saved, guided, and developed. The West mastered this psychology. Control the narrative, and you control the choices. The idea that African nations should always comply to remain stable was sold as wisdom, while submission was disguised as diplomacy. But now, that narrative is cracking. Burkina Faso didn't just refuse a deportation deal, it refused the mindset that Africa must always accommodate others at its own expense. This is where the transformation becomes ideological. Captain Ibrahim Traoré and his government have built their policy around a single, unwavering truth. Africa's strength begins where its fear ends. When you remove fear of aid cuts, of visa bans, of economic isolation, what remains is clarity. And clarity is dangerous to those who thrive on dependency. The moment Burkina Faso chose dignity over deals, it proved that moral sovereignty is still a form of power, perhaps the rarest and most unshakable kind. But the implications stretch far beyond Ouagadougou. Across the continent, this decision is being studied, discussed, and quietly admired. It's not just about standing up to the West, it's about standing up for Africa. It's a philosophy that says Africa's people are not commodities, its borders are not bargaining chips, and its dignity is not for sale. This idea doesn't need permission to spread, it moves through hearts, not embassies. And that's what makes it unstoppable. When a new generation of African leaders and citizens begin to see refusal as a right, not a risk, the balance of global diplomacy shifts forever. Because suddenly, the West's traditional tools, sanctions, visa restrictions, and economic threats lose their psychological grip. Once you've learned to live without validation, punishment no longer works. Still, this newfound independence comes with responsibility. Africa must now prove that self-respect can coexist with progress, that rejecting dependency doesn't mean rejecting development. The world will watch for failure, hoping to say, see, they couldn't do it alone. That's why this moment isn't just about resistance, it's about what follows it, building economies, industries, and institutions that don't rely on approval from Washington or Brussels. And this is where Burkina Faso's defiance becomes a blueprint, a test of whether Africa can finally lead itself without asking for directions. The refusal to take deportees was never about migration. It was about migration of thought, from dependence to determination, from obedience to ownership. What began as a standoff over visas has become a lesson in sovereignty. Because once a nation learns to say no to coercion, it begins to say yes to its future. And that's the quiet revolution spreading across the continent. A renaissance born not from aid or reform, but from the simple, unyielding declaration, Africa bows to no one. History doesn't always change through wars or treaties. Sometimes, it changes through a single word spoken with conviction. Burkina Faso's defiance may not make front-page headlines in Washington, but in Africa, it echoes like a drumbeat of awakening. This is no longer about one country, it's about a continent remembering its worth. The world may not realize it yet, but the balance is already shifting. A new Africa is emerging, unbought, unbowed, and unafraid. And from this point forward, no nation can claim to speak for Africa again. Africa will speak, and the world will listen. If Africa can stand up to the most powerful nation on earth and walk away unshaken, what excuse do other nations still have for silence? Let us know in the comment section. How long will we keep trading dignity for visas, when self-respect could open bigger doors than any embassy ever could? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.